Welcome. My name is Alexia Cortez, and I am part of the Government Affairs team at the Public Policy Institute of California. We would like to thank you for joining us today as we hear the results from our latest statewide survey on Californians and education. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, the Public Policy Institute of California is a nonpartisan, nonprofit public policy think tank headquartered in San Francisco with offices here in Sacramento. Today's event is part of the James Irvine Foundation briefing series, and we would like to thank them for making this program possible. You should have received 2 handouts on your chair. One contains the key findings from today's survey that we will discuss in a few moments, and the other is a fact sheet on early childhood education. The complete survey, as well as the briefing slides from today's presentation, are now available on our website. I'd like to mention an upcoming PPIC event. Next Thursday, we will be back here for a rather unique briefing in that it combines 2 newly released reports, both on the topic of K-12 education, and that is titled Achievement Gaps and Graduation Requirements. Seats remain available, and additional information, as well as a link to the registration, can be found under the News and Events tab on our website. Lastly, you will receive an event evaluation survey. This will be emailed to you later today, and we ask that you please take a few moments to fill that out to let us know how we did today. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Lunna Lopes is a research associate at PPIC, and she is the project manager for today's survey. When she is finished with the presentation, we will open it up to audience Q&A, so we hope that you will stick around for that. Now I'd like to hand it over to Lunna. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Alexia, and thank you all for coming today. So before I get started, I just want to thank the funders that made this survey possible. The survey was supported with funding from the Bechtel Foundation, the Dirk and Charlene Capsnell Foundation, the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment, the Silver Giving Foundation, and the Stewart Foundation. And before we get into the results and the findings of the survey, I just want to give a brief overview of the PPIC statewide surveys. So the goal of the statewide survey is to provide timely, relevant, and nonpartisan data on political and social and policy opinions. We hope to inform and improve the state policymaking process by raising awareness and encouraging discussion. And our goal with the survey is to really provide a voice for all Californians on important state policy debates. So since 1998, we've interviewed more than 320,000 Californians in over 150 surveys. This survey was the 12th annual Californians in Education survey. We asked questions on state government and local schools, which include approval ratings of the governor and the legislature, questions on school funding and teacher quality and shortage, among other things. We also focused on some of the major reforms that are going on in the education in the state, including Common Core, Smarter Balanced Assessment, local control, and the LCFF and LCAP. We interviewed over 1,700 adults from April 3rd to the 12th, and of those we had 507 parents and 375 public school parents. So starting with our section on state government and local schools, we typically ask the approval ratings of the governor and the legislature every survey. For the education survey, we also ask the approval rating on how they're handling K through 12 public education. Here we see today that 54% of Californians and a similar proportion of likely voters approve of the job the governor is doing overall. However, approval on K through 12, his handling of K through 12 education is slightly lower. As you'd expect, there are some partisan divisions, with Democrats being more likely to approve of the governor and Republicans less likely to do so. Approval of the legislature today is at 48% among all adults. And again, we see a similar trend with approval on the specific K through 12, their handling of K through 12 public education being slightly lower. And the lower approval ratings for the governor and the legislature on K through 12 is mostly a result of more people saying don't know, because they just don't have, they aren't as familiar or feel like they can give an opinion on specific handling of that policy area. So. Next, we asked a series of questions about funding for public schools. And the first question we asked was whether Californians think the current level of state funding for their local public schools is enough, more than enough, just enough, or not enough. Here we see that a majority of Californians, 61%, think that the funding is not enough. So Republicans are less likely to say that funding is not enough. This is in light of really an increase in state funding going to public schools in recent years. So we found it interesting that you still have a pretty solid majority of Californians who still feel like funding is not enough. We also asked about extending Proposition 30 tax increases. We found that more than 6 in 10 adults and likely voters favor extending the Proposition 30 income tax increase. However, there's a really notable partisan divide. You see more than 8 in 10 Democrats favor or extending the income tax increase from Prop 30. Republicans, 2/3 are against. So we see a real big divide there across the parties. And another school funding initiative that voters will likely see on the November ballot will be a state bond for school construction projects. We found strong support for a state bond measure, with 76% of adults saying that they would vote yes on a state bond measure for school construction. And here again, we see really high support among Democrats. More muted support among Republicans, but even among Republicans, you have 51% who say that they would vote yes. So, we also asked Californians about local measures for raising revenue for schools. When asked about a local bond measure for school construction, which would require a majority vote of 55% to pass, we found that 74% of adults and slightly fewer likely voters would vote yes on a local bond measure to pay for school construction projects. However, when we asked about a parcel tax, which would require 2/3 majority support to pass, we found that support was somewhat lower, especially among likely voters, with only 52% of likely voters saying they would vote yes on a local parcel tax measure. And turning to the quality of public schools, we asked Californians how big of a problem is the quality of public education in California today. And we found that 40% said it was a big problem. And this marks a record low since we began asking that question in 1998. We also found that a majority of adults give their local schools a grade of A or B, so they're a relatively positive rating when it comes to their local schools. Though, as you can see, there are some stark differences across racial and ethnic groups, with blacks being far less likely to give their local public schools a positive rating of A or B. And turning to school teachers, we asked Californians how big of a problem is teacher quality and a shortage of teachers in California today. While 30% said that teacher quality was a big problem, we found that 53% said that a shortage of teachers was a big problem in the state today. And given concerns about a teacher shortage, we asked Californians how they would most prefer that state and local government attract new teachers. And we found that we gave them a few options. Pluralities across most demographic groups said that they would prefer to increase the minimum starting salary. And fewer said that they would choose providing forgivable loans for teacher education, providing housing assistance and mortgage guarantees, or reducing some of the requirements needed to get a teaching credential. So by and far, out of those options, increasing the minimum starting salary was the preferred choice. We also asked Californians how they feel their schools are doing in preparing students for the future in terms of preparing them for college and also preparing them for jobs in the workforce. And we found that a majority of adults say their local public schools are doing an excellent or good job on both of these metrics. And at least half have said that since April 2013. As you can see, there's a real positive, steady positive trend on this question in recent years. So. We also asked about issues of inequity. In this survey, we asked about how concerned Californians are about lower income areas, students in lower income areas of the state being less likely to be ready for college when they finish high school. So we have 53% of Californians who say they're very concerned about this. And across racial and ethnic groups, we see there's a big difference here with 77% of blacks saying they're very concerned about this issue, where fewer Latinos, whites, and Asians say they're very concerned. So this is just the very concerned. Overall, majorities across all these racial and ethnic groups say that they're very or somewhat concerned. Next, the second half of our survey focused on the policy changes that have been implemented in recent years in the state. So I'm going to start by going over some of the questions we asked about Common Core and Smarter Balanced Assessment, and then move on to discussing local control, the new funding formula, and LCAP involvement. So in 2014, the state began implementing the Common Core standards, and we wanted to see if Californians have become more aware of Common Core. We found that today, 2/3 of adults have heard about Common Core. This is a slight increase from last year when only 58% of adults had said that they heard of the new standards. And among public school parents, we found awareness to be higher, with 3 in 4 having heard about the Common Core standards. And that's to be expected somewhat since we have 6 in 10 of public school parents who said that they have received information about Common Core from their child's school. So of public school parents, we have 4 in 10 said that they received information and found that information to be helpful. However, a further 22% said that they received information but feel like they need more information. And about 1/3 said that they were not provided with information on Common Core from their child's school. Next, we asked about just overall support for Common Core. Californians are somewhat divided on this policy. 43% of adults favor the new standards, and 39% oppose it. Public school parents are slightly more likely to favor Common Core, as you can see, just 51% favor. But really, the thing that we noticed is that this is a pretty polarizing issue among parties, where you have Democrats are somewhat divided there, but tend to be more likely to favor the policy. But Republicans, 62% oppose it. So there's real kind of a consensus gelling among Republicans, about opposing Common Core. Despite some division on the policy itself, we found that a majority of Californians are very or somewhat confident that teachers are adequately prepared to implement the new standards. And among public school parents, confidence is even higher, with 7 in 10 expressing, at least some confidence in teacher preparedness. However, we do see that across racial and ethnic groups, Latinos are the most likely to express confidence, and Blacks are the least likely to do so. Again, even though there is some division on the policy, on overall support for the policy itself, a majority of Californians are confident that the Common Core standards will help students be more college ready. And similar, a majority think that the standards will help students develop critical thinking skills, which is another one of its stated goals. And even though we have a majority expressing some confidence, again, we see a partisan divide, with Republicans being less likely to express confidence on both of these questions. And last spring, following the implementation of Common Core, California students took the first Smarter Balance test. And we asked parents last April, about their familiarity, what they've heard about the Smarter Balance assessment. And we really found that less than half of parents had heard anything about it. This year, we saw a slight increase, with now a majority of parents saying they have heard at least a little about the new assessments. And we still have 45%, however, of public school parents who said they've heard nothing at all. Similarly, last April, we asked parents to kind of predict how well they thought California students were going to perform on the Smarter Balanced assessment compared to how they've performed in previous tests. And we found that a plurality of 42% expected scores to be about the same as those on previous tests. And as you may know, in the fall, when the results came out, it showed that a smaller share of students had met or exceeded standards. So, however, we found that today, when we asked public school parents, how they think California students did perform, a plurality still believe that the students performed about the same as they have on previous tests. Only a quarter of public school parents correctly said that students, scored lower on the new assessments. Next, we're going to kind of go over the questions that we asked on local control and LCFF. We asked Californians overall who they thought had the most control over spending state government funds for local public schools. And we found that despite the implementation of LCFF, 55% of Californians still believe that the state government has the most control. However, we followed up that question asking Californians who they think should have the most control. And here we see that 45% think local school districts should have the most control, and a further 37% think the local schools. So these results are not that surprising given the next slide, which is 69% of Californians haven't heard anything about LCFF. So that would explain those results in the previous slide. And we see that awareness has increased slightly, 6 points from last year about LCFF, but the vast majority of Californians still remain pretty unaware of it. That said, given their preference for local school district and local schools having control, we find that when we read a brief description of LCFF, there's really widespread support for the funding policy. 76% of Californians and 77% of public school parents favor the new funding formula. And this is across parties. There's pretty strong support. So not only are Californians kind of inclined to favor LCFF, we also see that there's 3 in 4 Californians think the implementation of this new funding formula will help improve student outcomes for lower income students and English language learners. So, however, we see some differences across racial and ethnic groups. Latinos and Asians are more likely to express confidence that the academic achievement will improve than blacks and whites, who are slightly lower. But still, there's a general sense of confidence that we will see improved student outcomes among those 2 groups. Next, LCFF requires school districts to develop, adopt, and update the 3-year local control accountability plans, the LCAPs. And as part of the LCAP process, the districts are required to reach out to parents and especially encourage engagement with lower income and English language learners. And what we found is that half of public school parents said that they were provided information on how to become involved in the LCAP process. And this is an increase of 9 points from last April. However, the participation rate here among public school parents is still very low, with 81% saying that they were not involved in the process. Next, I want to cover some of the findings we had in our some questions we asked about early childhood education and preschool. We found that overall Californians feel that attending preschool is very important for future success in K through 12. This is particularly true of blacks and Latinos across race and ethnic groups. Whites and Asians are somewhat less likely to say it's very important, but overall there's a general belief that preschool is really key for future success in K through 12. And we also wanted to know what are the problems that Californians kind of thought are facing preschool education in California. And we asked about quality and affordability. And here we see that while 20% of Californians think that quality of preschool is a big problem, really they're twice as likely to think that affordability is a big problem, with 42% saying that is a big problem in California today. We also asked whether, given some expect the state to have a surplus, if Californians would prefer to use some of that surplus to fund early childhood education programs in the state, or whether they would prefer to pay down the debt and build up the reserve. Here we see that a majority of Californians, more than 6 in 10, would favor increasing funding for public preschool and early childhood education programs. However, there's a really stark partisan divide here, as you can all see. So, just kind of to conclude and go over the kind of key findings that we found in this survey, we found that most Californians still feel that state funding for local schools is not enough. And we also see that, with this sense that funding isn't enough, there is pretty strong support for school bond measures, less so for parcel taxes, especially given the higher hurdle that they must clear. And though a majority of Californians give their local schools relatively high marks, there's still some concern about just overall inequity and the quality of education in the state as a whole. Though people tend to be a bit more positive about their local schools. And Common Core as a policy is still, fairly politically divisive in the state. Californians are still pretty divided in support for the policy. However, there is, a majority of Californians do feel that it will achieve its stated goals. So, and when it comes to LCFF, really, few Californians continue to say they've heard anything at all about it, but the policy does seem to mesh with their preferences for funding or spending control. in public education, and when presented with a short description, we do see really high levels of favorability across all demographic groups for the policy. And when it comes to early childhood education and preschool, there's a real sense in California that it is a really important foundation for K through 12. And there's some desire there to increase funding for early childhood education programs. Though, as you saw in the previous slide, there are some really partisan differences that would have to be overcome. So now, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take some questions. Yes. Oh, there's a mic coming, so just a.
I think it's your fourth bullet point on this thing. The 4 in 10 adults think the quality of K through education state's a big problem. You kind of say that's a record low.
Yeah.
Is there any reasoning why that's I mean, it almost seems like people think quality education is getting better.
Yeah, I think that there's as just the overall economic kind of foundation of the state and funding levels have gone up, you do see, I think maybe that might be something that is really translating, but you don't hear because in good times you're less likely to hear about massive cuts and layoffs, and so maybe it's a matter of parents kind of feeling that they've seen that difference. And what we see too is across these questions, parents tend to be more positive than non-parents on a lot of these issues. So it might be that's impacting that. So any other questions? Yes.
Where does the Republican dislike of Common Core come from?
We didn't really ask a question that really gets at that. Though I think that there's if you are following the presidential race, there's in general I think the national conversation on Common Core might be something that's impacting that. So. But we didn't really ask a question that would get at to why there is that dislike. So they are slightly more likely to say that they have heard about Common Core. So very slightly, but yeah.
There are two line graph. One is the how satisfactory to the California legislature. Mm-hmm. The other is the how students are prepared for college readiness. These two line graphs are very similar to the economy with the 2010 at the bottom. So did you take a look at the overall picture and the economy, and could it be the economy as a latent factor?
Yeah, we see that especially with approval of the legislature and to some extent the governor, but it really does tend to kind of line up very closely to the economic conditions of the state. So as the economy worsens, approval with elected officials tends to decline. So I think that would explain some of that. Yeah.
Jeff Tartagia, how many of the local school districts are fully ready to implement the Common Core?
I think that there's some debate over that. So it's not really something that we, kind of covered in the state. But I think that, the next event, which PPIC will hold, that gets at achievements and meeting requirements, will probably have kind of deeper information on that.
Yes, Jeff Bell, Contra Costa County Board. One of the concerns we have, you mentioned that 6 of the 10 adults basically state that we don't have enough funding for education. See, at the community level, we're finding it totally opposite. Matter of fact, we're seeing that they're not saying the funding, they're saying the funding is not being applied appropriately, meaning in terms of efficiently. They're thinking it's not getting to the students themselves at the administrative level. So and that's why, we monitor from the county, we monitor the LCAPs. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, we find it's not necessarily the money, it's the inclusion and real transparency that the parents and the community groups are complaining about. So I would like to see more in depth in terms of study as it relates to what are the people saying. I mean, and not just general select adults, but in some of the groups, like, for example, in Far East County, Contra Costa, and other areas where it's very difficult, there are mass exodus of students. Yeah. We're seeing that really they're complaining about the administrative aspect, and that the LCAP as it relates and the LCF funding although it's more than it has been in the last 5 or 7 years,
Mm-hmm.
the results aren't there.
Right.
So that's a fact.
Right. Well, I think one question that we didn't cover here is we asked, Californians if they think that the school districts that receive additional funding from the LCFF, if they'll, how confident are you that they'll use that money for programs targeted at English language learners and low-income students? We found that a majority of Californians are at least somewhat confident that the money will be used for those programs. So in terms of confidence of, it's not as high as, overall support for LCFF, but there is a general sense of confidence that some of that money will be used for its kind of intended purpose. Yes.
Just a quick clarification on one of your slides. I think you had a slide that indicated, did parents think that children would do better? And then you had statistics on how actually they did more poorly?
No, so last year we asked a question about, it was last April, we asked how well they thought students were going to do. And most thought that they were going to do as well as they have on previous tests. This year we kind of asked, okay, well, they've taken the test, the results came out, how well do you think they did? And we found that, a plurality still felt that they did as well as they had on previous tests, when in reality they did, slightly poorer than they have.
Right. So you matched what the objective measure was to what the perception was. Do you do this on other ones of these characteristics, like do people do better with kindergarten? Do people do with preschool and the like? Or was that just one question?
We just did it for this question, just because we kind of wanted to see, looking back, if especially after parents should have gotten some notifications about how the performance of their children and whatnot. So we wanted to know if perception, if it finally kind of caught up, given the additional kind of coverage after the results came out. So, yeah. Yes.
On the fact sheet, you break out the attitudes about preschool by demographics. Oh, thank you. I was wondering if in the full report you break out some of the responses by the respondents' income levels, or low income, middle, and high.
Yeah, we can definitely. I have, if you come meet me afterwards, I have the kind of for the crosstabs, so I could look at that for you. Also, the full data set and crosstabs are available on our website, which would have those numbers broken down by income levels. So.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
So since you didn't break it out on the fact sheet, I'm interested in the attitudes about preschool and the affordability and quality.
Question?
Do you recall if the respondents' income levels or categories of income?
I don't recall off the top of my head. I believe that there was slightly more concern or likelihood to say it's a big problem among higher income. But I have the crosstabs, so once I'm finished, if you want to come over, I can look that up for you. Any other questions?
Excuse me, what is the full documentation report that we look on the website for?
It'll just be it should be pretty prominent. It's under the statewide survey section, the Californians and Education April 2016 survey. These slides will be up on the event page for this event, and the full report and then the questionnaire with all the questions in the back and access to the crosstabs, so you can see kind of all the questions by race, ethnicity, income level, education. All of that's available on the site.
Again, you mentioned that half of Californians think that a shortage of teachers is a big problem in the state. Obviously, that's a problem. But nevertheless, I don't know what your data show as it relates to the teachers' qualifications and the teachers' experience tend to make more of a difference in terms of people outcome as opposed to just having a teacher in the classroom. Do you have any data as it relates to what can we do to improve the quality, or what the individuals are saying about the quality of teacher in terms of their preparation and their experiences?
Right, so we don't have questions that get exactly that. What we did ask was the same way that we asked how big of a problem is a teacher shortage, we asked how big of a problem is the quality of teachers. And we found that only 30% of Californians said that was a big problem. So it seems like when we're comparing those two questions, that there's more concern about the shortage than there is about the quality right now. So.
Just to follow up on what the gentleman was saying, I did a tour of public schools and charter schools, and I spent 2 weeks, and I went to a lot of charter schools, and what a lot of the parents are saying, the reason the kids are failing in the charters is because they have a 2-year contract with the teachers, and when the teachers don't get them scores up, they get rid of the teachers. So the students come in and used to the way this teacher was teaching them, and you have 3 or 4 different teachers coming in every day, and the kids are lost. So their grades are going down like that because these teachers signed an 18-month to 2-year contract, and if they're not up to standard where the charter wants those scores, they're gone. Now, I visited the public schools. The kids was excited about seeing their teacher every morning, the same teacher, and if you talk to the parents, they feel that that's where a lot of the slack is coming from also. It's not the teacher's fault. It's the administration's fault, but not in the public school side and some of the charter side.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really get at any questions that really kind of, ask people to kind of place blame on where things are going wrong. But, overall, I think while there's still some concern about, education in the state, we see that, especially your public school parents seem to be very happy, or not very happy, a lot happier than, or have a more positive outlook on education, I think, than adults overall. Yes?
I was interested if you had any insights into the question that says 8 in 10 parents aren't involved in local decision making when they could be, and yet they feel like decisions should be made at that level. They want to bring it down, but we don't want to take responsibility.
Right.
So any insights there, any questions getting at then who should be making those changes?
Right. Well, I think, when we asked that question about, who should have control over spending, there's a preference for local schools and local school districts. And I think that, it might be parents want to say, but, we found that 81% weren't involved in the LCAP. I think that, parents might just want to be informed about the decisions that they're making or have an avenue, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see, every, a really high proportion of parents, being able even to really take as an involved role in that kind of, not just their, kids' education, but like in that bureaucratic kind of more, decision making. So, a lot of parents are busy with work and, they're trying to read their kids and things like that. But when it comes to, they might want to be kept informed, but not necessarily, have the resources time-wise or otherwise to really, get us involved. But we did see, I think about 15% of parents who said that they were involved in the LCAP process. So,
Any sense of the demographics of those folks?
The sample size gets a bit too small, so for us to really break that out. Unfortunately, we can't really get much deeper than that.
Ms. Lopez, when you guys were conducting the study, are there any data? Did you get into the safety issue in the schools as it relates to bullying and such?
Yeah, no, we didn't.
Major. Do you have any? I didn't see anything on.
We didn't ask any questions about. Obviously, no. I mean, obviously, we tried to cover quite a few topics, so that's one that we were unable to kind of get to.
That is a tremendous issue for parents. The safety, concerns of safety.
Yeah, I mean, we have limited questions that we can kind of ask. So I will say that
next year, I mean, would you consider that issue seriously? Because safety is paramount. I mean, it's paramount. Sure. The kid's not safe. The parents are not going to keep them in the schools, nor will a teacher teach in an unsafe environment.
Right. Well, I'll say that last year we asked a question, an open-ended question, which was what was the biggest problem facing education in California, and we didn't really see a high number of people mentioning safety. However, we had people could say anything they wanted, and as we were coding the other responses that didn't really fit into the top responses, we did see a certain proportion of it was very small who thought that was the biggest problem facing California. So undoubtedly it probably is a problem facing, and there's a lot of regional variances on that, but we just didn't really see it rise to the level of concern that parents and the public in general have about just the overall quality of education, teacher shortage, funding issues. So we decided to kind of prioritize those just because from last year what we saw is that those are some of the key concerns that.
Moving forward, would you consider some of that nature again, and perhaps preference the questions in a little different sense?
Yeah, I mean we'll definitely have a look.
Okay.
Obviously, we like to keep as many questions that we can track differences over time because that adds quite a bit of value to seeing changing opinions. But it's definitely something we'll definitely discuss in our as we get together next year for this.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna hold you to that too. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. All right, one more.
Hi, I'm glad the safety issue came up. Thank you for bringing that up. I am curious as to the languages that you might be interviewing community members, or languages other than English.
Yeah, so we do interview in English and Spanish. So we do interviews on cell phones and landlines. So yeah, we do Spanish language interviews as well. Okay. Great. Well, thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to present our findings.